Michael Bain had not come to the mountain seeking silence, though the world around him certainly offered it. The air was sharper here, cleaner, unfiltered by the smog and weight of a city life. His newly purchased cabin sat at the edge of a sprawling ridge in northern Appalachia, a modest yet solid structure built decades ago by hands that understood wood and weather. The cabin was older than most of the houses in the valley below, which had since turned into a semi-organized patchwork of rural neighborhoods, the kind with unofficial road signs, self-appointed gatekeepers, and no real governing body. Yet, somehow more rules than any city Michael had ever lived in. He hadn't grown up in these parts, nor did he have any sentimental attachment to the region. The purchase had been logical, maybe even a little cold. A clean title, a quiet location, enough land for privacy, but not so much he'd have to hire a groundskeeper. He was in his early 60s now, still fit, sharp, a man whose calm made others uncertain how to read him. For over 3 decades he had advised clients in the private security sector, the type of work that paid well, taught restraint, and left little space for embellishment or ego. He wasn't retired, just reorganizing his life. The mountain property was the first real step in that shift. When he arrived, the trees were starting to darken into fall color, and the wind had already changed its voice. It whistled differently through the pine thickets, almost like it carried a warning to those who knew how to hear it. Michael didn't mind. He had always been good at sitting still while the world moved. The first few days passed with quiet productivity, clearing the driveway of summer debris, checking the plumbing and the generator, setting up motion-activated lights along the path to the woodshed, more out of habit than necessity. He didn't expect trouble out here. That was perhaps his only miscalculation. The first contact came in the form of a voice, not a face, the kind of voice that doesn't ask questions so much as issue declarations disguised as neighborly concern. "Excuse me, sir, do you live here?" Michael turned toward the sound, wiping his hands on a rag. He had been adjusting a loose hinge on the side gate when the young man appeared, standing just outside the property line, arms crossed. He looked to be in his late 20s, maybe early 30s, built like someone who lifted weights for appearances rather than utility. His short-sleeved shirt bore a patch that read Community Patrol, though it was clearly homemade, ironed on, slightly crooked. "I do," Michael answered, not hostile but not inviting either. The man narrowed his eyes. "Can I see some ID?" Michael raised an eyebrow. "You first." There was a long pause, not angry, but charged in that way men test each other when territory is involved. The younger man huffed, then said, "This road is part of a private network monitored by the Valley community. We've had a few people trying to squat in unoccupied cabins. I need to confirm you're not one of them." Michael nodded slowly, stepped back from the gate, and picked up a folder from the small folding table beside the cabin wall. Inside, it was his purchase agreement, the property deed, the notarized county land survey, all legitimate and dated just over 6 weeks ago. He offered the documents across the fence. The man took a quick glance, frowning. "I didn't ask for the deed. I asked for ID," he said. Michael smiled faintly. "What would seeing my ID accomplish that this doesn't?" The man hesitated. "It's standard. We log all residents." "We?" Michael repeated. "Is there a formal board I should be speaking with? Or are you the sheriff now?" The man's jaw twitched, clearly unused to being challenged. "I'm Trevor. My mom's on the regional council. She asked me to do a sweep." Michael didn't laugh, but he came close. "Well, Trevor, you've seen my papers. I think that concludes the sweep." Trevor stood his ground a moment longer, then turned and walked off with exaggerated slowness, as if to prove he wasn't retreating. Michael watched until he disappeared around the bend where the gravel drive met the lower trail. He wasn't angry. Not yet. But there was something in the kid's demeanor, something territorial, juvenile, and dangerously self-righteous. That evening, Michael received his second signal. The gravel at the end of the road had been rearranged, not disturbed in a messy way, but shaped deliberately. A short chain, looped between two wooden posts, now blocked the access point where his private drive met the shared lane. No signs, no explanation, no indication that this was temporary. Just there, as if it had always been. Michael didn't touch it. He wasn't foolish. Instead, he walked back to the cabin, poured himself a cup of black coffee, and took a slow drive around the perimeter of his property via the old logging road on the north end. It was longer, rougher, and poorly maintained, but it connected him to the paved county road just as well. He drove to the nearest sheriff's office the next morning, not to file a complaint, but to verify records. He introduced himself to the deputy on duty, explained the situation without drama, and presented his documents again. The deputy, a solid man named Rickman with the kind of eyes that had seen too much boredom and not enough excitement, reviewed the paperwork carefully. "You're good," Rickman said finally. "Cabin's registered in your name. Road access is unrestricted. You can take photos of that barrier if you want. We'll file it in case it escalates." Michael nodded. "I'm not looking for trouble. But I don't respond well to being challenged on my own land." Rickman gave a dry chuckle. "You'll fit in around here just fine." But that wasn't entirely true. Over the following days, the valley grew colder, and not just in temperature. Neighbors he hadn't met yet began turning their backs before he could even raise a hand. A box of supplies he had ordered was left at the county junction instead of delivered to his doorstep. The gas station attendant stopped saying hello. A woman walking her dog changed direction when she saw him approaching. He began to feel the edges of something heavier than hostility, not just resistance, but orchestration. One morning, he found the side door of the tool shed slightly ajar. Nothing appeared stolen at first, but one of his hammers had been moved, set deliberately in the center of the workbench like a calling card. Another day, the generator failed, though it had been serviced just a month prior. When he opened the housing, the fuel line had been unclamped. Not severed, that would have been blatant, just enough to cause sputtering. Michael didn't report any of it, not yet. He documented everything. Photos, notes, timestamps. He wasn't interested in paranoia, just clarity. A man who spent his life helping others prepare for the worst didn't jump at shadows, but he didn't ignore them either. Then came the envelope. No address, no postage. Just tucked under his cabin door one rainy afternoon. Inside was a single line, typed on an old printer ribbon. "This place doesn't like outsiders. We'll wait you out." No threats, no names, nothing actionable. Just atmosphere, pressure, and that, Michael knew, was often more effective than any direct confrontation. It got into your skin, turned neighbors into ghosts and silence into suspicion. It broke people down slowly until they packed up and left without ever filing a report. He had seen it before. Not in mountain towns, but in cities, companies, even agencies that used social gravity to eject those who didn't conform. He recognized the strategy. What they didn't realize yet was that they were playing it against someone who had trained people in that very art. Michael folded the note, slid it into a labeled folder, and placed it in his lockbox. He wasn't leaving. Not yet. And certainly not like that. The rain didn't let up for 3 days. The kind of mountain rain that seeps into the ground like it's trying to soak through to the bones of the earth itself, turning gravel into mush and air into a fine mist that clings to your skin like sweat. During those days, Michael kept himself busy with the inside of the cabin. He repaired the shelves in the pantry, recalibrated the old boiler system, made small improvements that wouldn't seem out of place to an outsider, but to him were vital, not just for functionality, but for anchoring himself to this place. Every screw tightened, every hinge adjusted was a quiet form of reclamation. Still, he kept one eye on the trail beyond the gate, where the barrier, the chain between posts, had been quietly removed, then reinstalled, then disappeared entirely again without explanation. The indecision of it irritated him more than the act itself. It wasn't bold enough to confront. It was passive, like someone testing boundaries to see how far they could stretch before getting snapped. On the morning the rain finally broke, Michael set out to retrieve a delivery that had been marked as held for pickup at the general store in the lower valley. It was an order of supplies for the roof. Waterproof sealant, a new tarp, a few replacement boards. Nothing dramatic, just upkeep. But the drive down felt different this time. The turns on the road seemed tighter, the trees closer, like the landscape had shifted slightly in the night while no one was watching. When he pulled up to the store, the delivery was waiting for him. But so was Trevor. The younger man stood by the porch rail, arms crossed again, same forced stance as before, only now he had an iPad in his hand, and the look of someone playing a role he didn't fully understand. "We've had some concerns," Trevor said, skipping greeting altogether. "Couple of neighbors saw you unloading things at night. People don't like that. They think it's suspicious." Michael looked at him for a long moment before answering. Not out of hesitation, but calculation. "I do my work when the weather allows. That's all it is." Trevor glanced down at his screen. "We've had break-ins lately. Some think it's connected." "To my unloading roofing supplies?" Michael asked, letting the tone go slightly dry. "You're new," Trevor said, shifting the goalposts. "You don't have history here. No one knows you. That makes folks uneasy." Michael raised an eyebrow. "That's not my problem." Trevor gave a thin smile. "It is if people start seeing you as a threat." There it was, not a threat, but a warning shaped like a neighborly gesture. The logic of weak men with too much idle time and just enough power to become dangerous. Michael leaned forward slightly. "Tell me something, Trevor. Are you doing this for your mother, or are you trying to be something you're not?" Trevor blinked, the question cutting sharper than expected. He opened his mouth to reply, but Michael was already turning away, lifting the box of supplies without strain and loading it into the back of his truck. He didn't look back as he drove off, didn't watch for Trevor in the side mirror. He didn't need to. He knew what this was now. They had tried the passive pressure. Now they were starting to escalate. When he got back to the cabin, the first thing he noticed was the silence, not the natural kind. Not birdsong or wind or stillness, but the artificial kind, the kind that means absence. The generator wasn't humming. The outdoor sensor lights didn't blink when he passed the gate. The cameras were offline. He parked, moved through the house calmly, checked the main line, disconnected. Not torn, not damaged. Someone had physically unplugged the network box in the utility shed and neatly coiled the power cord next to it. Michael stood there for a moment, not angry but alert. Whoever had done it knew not to destroy anything. They wanted to send a message, not trigger a legal response. It was performance, crafted to frustrate but not provoke. The kind of action that wouldn't leave fingerprints, wouldn't make the sheriff get off his chair, but would leave just enough impact to make someone question their place. He reconnected the system manually, checked each camera. They had all been powered off, but none tampered with. He reviewed the internal logs and found something interesting. All 4 had gone offline at the exact same timestamp 2 nights ago, 2:17 a.m. The footage before that showed nothing except fog, rain, and the occasional passing deer. Whoever had done it either knew the system's blind spots or had spent enough time watching to learn them. That night, he didn't sleep much, not out of fear, but because his instincts told him something else was coming. He stayed inside, lights off, listening. At 3:12 a.m., his patience paid off. A soft scrape outside near the side of the cabin. Not footsteps, metal. Michael moved silently to the kitchen, slipped the curtain just a fraction. Moonlight revealed a shadow near the tool shed. Not big, maybe 5.5 feet tall, wearing a hoodie, moving slowly, trying not to make sound. He didn't go out, didn't confront. Instead, he waited. The figure did nothing dramatic, just leaned into the side of the shed for a moment, and then left. 20 minutes later, they were gone. The next morning, he found another note, tucked under a stone by the steps, typed again in the same mechanical font. "You think you're safe because you're polite. We know what you are." Michael kept this one too. By the following week, his mail started arriving late. Sometimes not at all. Packages marked as delivered never showed up. A tarp he had ordered came shredded, folded neatly in the box as if it had been like that from the start. He called the post office, but they insisted everything had gone out as normal. The driver didn't report any issues. One clerk even suggested perhaps the box had been damaged before shipment. Maybe he should check with the sender. Small things, piling on. Then came the call from the county assessor's office. A woman with a clipped tone informed him that a claim had been submitted regarding property boundary clarification for his lot. Someone had anonymously filed a request to review whether the cabin was within its proper easement, citing long-standing communal rights to the ridge access. Michael listened quietly, then asked for a copy of the submission. The woman hesitated, then agreed to send the summary. It arrived that afternoon via email. He recognized the phrasing. The submission referenced historical access paths, communal forest use, and unauthorized modifications to landscape near water runoff. None of it was true, but it was written with just enough formality to trigger a county review. Michael stared at the document. The request hadn't come from Trevor. The wording was too clean, too well-structured. This was Karen. He hadn't met her yet, not directly, but he didn't need to. She was behind this. The manipulation of systems, the whispers, the choreography of low-level chaos, it all reeked of someone used to controlling narratives without ever entering the room. The storm was building, and Michael understood the terrain now. This wasn't about property, it was about obedience, territory, and the quiet war of endurance. And he was not planning to blink first. By the second week, Michael stopped referring to what was happening as a dispute. Disputes implied equal footing, a disagreement where both parties recognized each other's claims and positions. This wasn't that. What was unfolding around him had no formal face, no central figure to confront, no paper trail that would point to a single culprit. It was a creeping pressure, a tightening of the social net, woven not with confrontation, but with subversion. And whoever was behind it, likely Karen, though he still hadn't spoken to her, understood how to weaponize implication, how to make silence louder than accusation. That morning, when he stepped outside to retrieve the folded tarp he had ordered a second time, he noticed a small wooden sign staked into the ground just beyond the property line, where the forest brush gave way to the overgrown gravel path. The sign was hand-carved with careful lettering that read, "For community use." No signature, no context. It wasn't on his land, technically, just beside it, but it was placed in such a way that anyone driving past would assume the trail behind it, which led straight through the north end of his property, was public access. It wasn't. He had the survey to prove it, but challenging that sign directly would paint him as the aggressor, the outsider who didn't respect local customs. He left it for now, but documented everything, took measurements, photos, and marked the GPS coordinates. Later that day, while replacing a warped plank on the south-facing deck, Michael heard movement down by the creek. Soft steps, light enough to suggest either a child or someone deliberately quiet. He didn't make his presence known immediately. Instead, he stepped inside, retrieved his binoculars, and scanned the slope through the dining room window. Near the base of the creek, a boy no older than 12 was standing by the water's edge. He was holding a fishing pole, not casting it, just letting the line drift. Michael watched for several minutes. The boy looked over his shoulder only once, not toward the cabin but toward the woods behind him. A signal? Hard to say. Michael finally stepped out and walked down the path openly. The boy didn't startle when he saw him approach. In fact, he seemed to expect it. "This is private land," Michael said, calmly but clearly. "You can't fish here without permission." The boy shrugged. "Everyone fishes here. Always have. Before the other guy sold it, we used to come here every weekend." Michael paused. "Who told you that?" The boy didn't answer. He reeled in the line, picked up a small tackle box, and left without another word, disappearing back into the trees where no trail should have existed. Michael didn't follow. He didn't need to. The point wasn't that the boy had fished there. It was that someone had sent him. Or at the very least, told him it was okay. Another move on the board. Small, but deliberate. That evening, Michael drove down to the county building again. He had made an appointment with the land use coordinator to clarify the status of his parcel's northern border and to confirm that no easements, historical or otherwise, had been reactivated. The coordinator, a thin man named Fulton with a twitchy manner and a cluttered office, assured him that no changes had been made. "Then how does a fabricated claim like this get to your desk?" Michael asked, setting down the copy of the community use submission. Fulton adjusted his glasses. "We have a standing review process for all boundary challenges. It doesn't require the claim to be substantiated, just formatted correctly." "So, anyone with a working knowledge of the language can file one?" Fulton hesitated, then nodded. "Technically, yes." Michael stared at him for a long second, then leaned forward. "I need you to log this conversation. I'm not making accusations. I'm documenting interference. Do you understand the distinction?" Fulton nodded more quickly this time. "Of course. I'll append it to the parcel file." On the drive back up the ridge, Michael noticed a dark SUV parked near the turnoff to his trail. Not moving, just sitting there with its engine off, nose pointed toward the valley road. He slowed, passed it, didn't break rhythm, but noted the plate. Local, registered in the same county. He didn't recognize it. By the time he reached his gate, he checked the security app again. The cameras were live and the power connection was stable, but the feed showed something strange. Several dark smudges near the camera lenses, not on the sensors themselves but on the surrounding housings. Grease, maybe. Or mud. Someone had come close enough to touch them. He reviewed the archived footage, but the timestamp around midday was missing 8 minutes. Not corrupted, just erased. A silent breach. Surgical. That night, the air shifted. It wasn't weather, it was intention. As the wind scraped the walls of the cabin with dry pine needles, Michael sat in the living room without turning on the lights. He let his eyes adjust to the dark, let the structure of the house blend into the natural rhythm of the mountain. Around 2:45 a.m., the sensor lights at the back flicked on for exactly 5 seconds. No movement registered on the monitor. He rose silently, checked the side camera. Nothing. But on the path behind the woodshed, he found a piece of cloth wedged under a rock. A child's glove. Same brand as the boy from the creek. He returned inside, locked the door, and opened his laptop. He pulled up the contact list for the sheriff's office and sent a non-urgent alert. Suspected minor trespassing, no confrontation, seeking a recorded incident number for insurance purposes. He knew the move would get logged and eventually reach Karen through whatever back channel she used. It wasn't meant as a complaint, it was a signal, a way of saying, "I'm documenting, not ignoring. I'm not reacting. I'm recording. And more importantly, I'm still here." 2 days later, while loading a crate of salvaged stone into his truck bed, Michael noticed movement by the far fence line. It was Karen. First time he'd seen her directly. She didn't approach, just stood there, arms folded, flanked by her son. Trevor looked less self-assured than he had at the store. Maybe because this time Michael didn't offer a greeting. Karen called out first. "We've been talking to some of the neighbors." They're concerned about the tone you're setting here. Michael set the crate down gently. Is that so? She walked closer, just enough to be heard without yelling. We've had a certain way of doing things in this area for a long time. Quietly, respectfully, no fences, no lights, no cameras. Michael didn't respond. He just let her speak. You've come in with all this structure, this barrier mentality. People feel like they're being watched in their own community. Michael tilted his head. Your people watched me long before I installed anything. Karen's eyes hardened slightly. You misunderstand. They watched because they were worried. No, Michael said. They watched because they were told to. Karen didn't flinch. That's not how this works. People here don't respond well to hostility. I haven't been hostile, Michael replied. But I have been consistent. And if that makes people uncomfortable, then maybe the problem isn't the structure. Maybe it's the exposure. She opened her mouth, then thought better of it. Trevor looked down at his boots. I won't ask you to leave, Karen said at last, but I will suggest that some people don't respond well to being challenged. Michael took a step forward, closing the space to a few feet. And I suggest you remember that not everyone fears consequences, especially not when they're manufactured. Karen didn't answer. She turned and left without another word. Trevor followed, silent. That night, Michael placed a second copy of every document he'd compiled into a waterproof container and buried it in the root cellar. He wasn't paranoid. He was methodical. The first escalation had come and gone. What followed would be uglier. And he would be ready. 3 days after the encounter at the fence line, Michael received a formal envelope that looked more bureaucratic than threatening, until he opened it. Inside was a notice from the County Land Services office advising him of an active petition to review conditional land use rights regarding his property, specifically a clause about undeclared environmental modification in historically shared buffer zones. It was nonsense on the surface, a pile of legal phrases stacked like bricks to make the letter sound official and credible, but Michael knew how these games were played. This wasn't an accusation, it was a wedge, paperwork designed not to punish, but to exhaust. If he ignored it, they'd escalate. If he fought it, he'd be buried in weeks of correspondence, delays, and procedural sludge. He didn't throw it out. He scanned it, filed it, and sent a brief reply to his attorney with the subject line. And so it begins. That same afternoon, as he walked the boundary of his property, he found something stranger than letters and legal maneuvering, an old campsite, freshly disturbed. It sat just 30 feet beyond his eastern border in what should have been a disused portion of state-managed land. But someone had built a low fire ring and left the remnants of a tarp partially buried under pine needles. There were signs of recent occupancy, crushed grass, a coffee tin still warm to the touch, and a shoe print small enough to suggest either a woman or a teenager. Michael didn't touch anything. He simply took photos and marked the GPS. He didn't need to know who it was. He already suspected. He only needed to keep building the chain of evidence, and that required restraint, not confrontation. Later that evening, his attorney called. Her name was Dana Chase, sharp-minded and unflappable, someone Michael had worked with years ago during a property litigation case in Nevada. She wasn't local, which was exactly why he trusted her. "This looks like a slow roll," she said after reviewing the scanned letter. "They're trying to frame you as someone who's disrupting a long-standing ecosystem of access and local use. It's not criminal, but it's the first step toward a claim of community easement. If they can convince enough people to say they've used your property openly for years, it builds a narrative." Michael was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Can they do it? If you don't push back in writing?" "Yes. It won't hold up long-term, but it can tie you up for months and make your property harder to insure or sell." "Understood," Michael said. "File the first reply. Be brief, but firm. "What about public opinion?" she asked. "Anyone on your side?" "No one vocal yet," he said, "but they're not all aligned. Some are watching Karen closely." "That's the woman?" "She doesn't act directly. She delegates. Thinks that protects her." "It usually does," Dana replied, "until it doesn't." Michael hung up and stepped out onto the porch. The night was heavy with moisture, the scent of moss rising from the earth. He could hear the faint hum of insects just beneath the stillness, and behind it all, the distant creak of tree limbs under pressure. The forest was alive, but subdued, much like the valley. That's when he saw them. Two figures moving past the edge of his property, flashlights turned low, steps careful. They weren't on his land, not yet, but they were circling it, mapping it, perhaps. He didn't move. He didn't shout. He just watched. The figures passed, unaware or unconcerned. The next morning, he visited the town library. Not to read, but to scan. It wasn't an intuitive move, but he remembered Dana's advice. Build a social map. Find the shape of influence. He searched archives of land disputes, public forums, minor news articles from the last 20 years. Karen's name showed up 3 times, in letters to the editor, petitions about heritage viewsheds, and a campaign to stop the construction of a cellular tower in the valley. Always the same phrasing. Community character, traditional patterns, shared stewardship. She used language like camouflage, phrases no one could publicly oppose without sounding like a developer or a colonizer. Michael copied them, flagged the articles, and left. On his way home, he stopped at a local feed store, partly for supplies, partly for presents. The clerk, a wiry man in his 50s named Ron, barely acknowledged him at first, but as Michael paid for a few fence post caps and a new hatchet, Ron suddenly said, "You fixing up the cabin?" Michael nodded once. Bit by bit. Ron hesitated, then added, "Used to be a guy up there, before you. Never bothered nobody, kept to himself." Michael waited. "They made it hard on him," Ron continued, not looking up. "Not all at once, but little things. Said his waterline was wrong. Accused him of shooting too close to a trail. Then one day, County showed up with a notice to vacate." "What happened?" Ron finally looked up. "He left." Michael nodded slowly. "That won't happen this time." Ron didn't smile, but he said, "Good." That night, the generator kicked off for 30 seconds, then rebooted. When Michael checked the diagnostics, he found something unusual. 3 failed password attempts on the remote control panel. Someone had tried to access the system via Bluetooth, probably from the woods. It hadn't worked, but it told him everything he needed to know. The escalation had begun in earnest. They were no longer just observing. They were probing, testing his limits, looking for friction points. He spent the next day reinforcing the perimeter, not with fences or lights, but with subtler methods. He planted dense shrubs along the most likely footpaths, added motion-triggered trail cams at knee height, and left visible decoys in places he knew would be bypassed. He didn't care if they saw them. In fact, he wanted them to. It would make them think they'd mapped his entire system. They hadn't. 2 nights later, the real break came. Just after 1 a.m., a white pickup rolled up the access road and stopped 50 feet from the gate. No lights, engine running. 2 silhouettes stepped out, paced for a moment, then got back in and drove off. The cameras caught the whole thing. He submitted the footage anonymously to the sheriff's office with no commentary, just a timestamp and location. 10 minutes later, the cabin phone rang. It was Rickman, the same deputy who had verified his property weeks ago. "We got it," Rickman said. "Unmarked truck. Belongs to a contractor who's done work for Karen before. You want us to act on it?" "Not yet," Michael said. "Just log it." "You playing the long game?" "No," Michael replied. I'm playing the true one. And with that, the midpoint passed. No turning back. The pressure was real, the opposition no longer passive, and the battle no longer theoretical. From here forward, everything would cost something. Time, energy, maybe more. But now, at least, the shape of the enemy was finally clear. The sound of a nail striking metal jolted Michael from half-sleep before dawn. It wasn't loud, just out of place, a single, deliberate tap like someone using a hammer on a pipe. He moved through the cabin silently, barefoot on the cool wooden floor, his eyes already adjusted to the low light. From the east window, he spotted it. A man crouched by the front corner of the property, partially obscured by the timber pile. The figure wasn't a child, wasn't trying to hide. He worked with practiced efficiency, hammering something into the soft soil just outside the clear boundary markers. Michael watched, calculating. The man wore no reflective gear, no contractor's vest, just a gray hoodie and jeans. There was no truck nearby, no equipment trailer. When the man finished, he stood, wiped his hands on his thighs, and walked back into the tree line. No rush. No glance toward the house, just vanished like smoke. Michael stepped outside moments later and found a new wooden stake in the ground, painted red at the tip, with a small tag affixed that read, "Pending easement review. Do not disturb." The tag looked official, but the font was wrong. The laminate. Flimsy. A copy of something real, passed off just well enough to fool someone unfamiliar with the county system. He didn't touch it. Instead, he called Dana. "They're trying to create visible indicators now," he said, "to reinforce the story. Make it look like the land is under dispute." Dana, on speakerphone from her office 4 states away, sounded unbothered. "Don't remove it. Photograph it, document it, and I'll file a notice of fraudulent posting with the assessor. If we move too fast, they'll pivot to something else, maybe escalate again. Let them build weight under their own narrative. When we push back, we need them overexposed." By noon, another delivery failed to arrive. Michael had ordered lumber through a regional supply depot and the invoice showed it left the yard on time. But when he called to ask where it had gone, the woman at the desk hesitated. "It says here it was redirected," she finally said. Alternate drop point was approved on site. Michael kept his tone neutral. "By whom?" "We don't have a name, just a notation. Authorized proxy signature." He didn't press. The wood was gone. It wouldn't come back. But the incident served a second purpose. It confirmed infiltration beyond social sabotage. Someone had now taken control of a transaction between him and an unrelated vendor. That meant someone had been watching his accounts, deliveries, and schedule closely enough to impersonate him or someone connected to the property. He updated Dana with a summary and spent the next 2 hours rotating his passwords, calling vendors, and locking down all standing orders. The intent wasn't theft. It was disruption. They didn't want his lumber. They wanted to derail his timeline, to slow his progress, and, ideally, to push him into confrontation with people who could later claim he had grown unstable or paranoid. That evening, a fire started on the western edge of his land. Not large, but deliberate. It burned through about 20 feet of dry brush before Michael caught it from his rear cameras. He had cleared a wide enough barrier weeks earlier that it didn't spread, but the smoke was real, and the heat left a mark. When the fire department arrived, summoned by a neighbor who saw smoke and got worried, the 2 firefighters who came out asked if he had been burning debris. Michael told the truth. "No fire started by me. I was inside all evening. You're welcome to check the footage." They declined, but noted that no source of ignition was immediately visible. Michael watched one of them glance toward the woods while writing his report. "Just say the cause is undetermined," Michael said calmly. The man nodded without expression. It wasn't the first fire they'd seen in these woods, and it wouldn't be the last. After they left, Michael walked the perimeter with a flashlight. Near the scorched edge he found a used flare casing, partially buried. He wore gloves, collected it into a Ziploc, and placed it in his growing evidence file. The following morning, Michael's phone rang while he was resealing the cabin windows. It was Rickman from the sheriff's office. "You should be aware," he said, voice low and measured, "that a formal complaint was filed against you this morning." "On what grounds?" Michael asked, unsurprised. "Allegedly," Rickman said, "you threatened a minor with physical harm. No witness statement, just a complaint submitted through the public channel. You'll receive a copy soon, but I wanted you to hear it from me first." Michael's jaw tightened. "Do they name the minor?" "Yes," Rickman said. "Boy named Eli Trent." Michael nodded slowly. That was the boy who fished on his land weeks ago. He hadn't threatened him, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't even approached aggressively. But someone was trying to turn the event into an incident. "I'm going to prepare a statement," Michael said, "and I'll attach time-stamped footage from the cameras. The entire encounter is on record." Rickman paused. "You sure you want to start submitting footage? Once it's in the system, they can subpoena all of it." "I'm aware," Michael said. "I'm not the one who needs to be worried." He spent that night carefully sorting the footage, trimming it for clarity, and pairing it with a written summary. The scene with Eli was calm, as he remembered. No hostility, no aggression. The file went to Dana, who prepared an official response. "This shifts us to Phase 2, she said during their evening call. "They've moved from passive interference to weaponizing community optics. The next step is likely coordinated signatures or public declarations." "Petitions?" Michael asked. "Letters to the county, maybe even the sheriff. Neighbors claiming you're dangerous, unwell, volatile. If they can't get you to react, they'll paint you as if you already have." Michael exhaled slowly. "Let them try." Days passed, each one laced with minor provocations. A dead squirrel left on his porch, positioned upright like a warning. Tire tracks across the far edge of his gravel path. Whispers near his window late one night. Unintelligible, but distinct. Then, one afternoon, a knock on the door. Two men in plain clothes stood on the porch. County agents, one holding a clipboard, the other a tablet. "We're here to conduct a visual assessment," the taller one said, not quite apologetic. "We received notice of unpermitted structural modifications, possible code violations." Michael stepped aside without a word, let them pass, and trailed them as they walked the exterior, inspecting the solar panels, the stonework, the added awning over the entry. They asked questions which he answered briefly. They took photos, which he allowed. At the end, the agent with the clipboard said, "Nothing egregious. Probably a misunderstanding. But we'll log the inspection just in case." Michael knew better. Nothing about this was a misunderstanding. Later that week, two separate vehicles were seen parked within walking distance of his property on consecutive nights. When Dana requested local traffic logs through a civil records liaison, she found that a pattern of complaints had been filed about unauthorized lighting disturbances and foreign surveillance behavior in the area. Coded language implying that Michael was the one watching others, not the one being watched. The strategy had flipped. No longer were they trying to isolate him. Now they were trying to contaminate his identity, to reframe him in the eyes of anyone who wasn't paying close attention. Michael responded not with anger, but with preparation. He had his property reassessed by an independent inspector and filed an updated certification of all structural upgrades. He reinforced his security with layered systems, none of them aggressive. Off-grid storage, shielded network backups, and time-lapse recorders that uploaded to an encrypted server every 24 hours. He didn't expect justice to arrive on its own. He knew better than most that clarity often needed to be constructed in real time. And if this game was about endurance, then he would outlast them, not by confrontation, but by removing every lie from their arsenal until they were forced to reveal the truth beneath it. The final confirmation came late one night when he received a single anonymous text on a backup phone he hadn't used in weeks. It read, "She's losing control." That's why she's pushing harder. They're not all with her. No signature, no context. But he recognized the syntax. It wasn't random. Someone inside the network had reached out, and that meant pressure was building not only on his side, but theirs. The second escalation had peaked, and pressure, Michael knew, didn't just reveal character, it created it. The rain returned just as the valley prepared for the autumn fair, a yearly event where the neighboring ridges came together under tents and local produce stands, a performance of small-town unity staged on the school's open field. Michael hadn't planned to attend, but Dana advised him otherwise. "Presence matters," she'd said during their last call. "They're trying to define you in your absence. Let them see you walk straight through the middle of it all, with nothing to hide." And so he went, not out of defiance, but for calibration. He dressed plainly, moved deliberately, avoided eye contact where unnecessary. He walked the perimeter once, paused by the maple syrup booth, then turned back. He stayed 20 minutes. That was enough. Enough for them to know he wouldn't be driven out. Enough for her to feel the pressure closing around her. Enough for the man with the camera phone to get the picture he was likely told to get. Michael didn't flinch. He let them record whatever story they thought they were writing. What they didn't know was that his own documentation had already reached the district office, packaged cleanly by Dana, and submitted with an official complaint for targeted harassment, misuse of local authority, and falsified easement claims. All backed by footage, timestamps, communications logs, and testimony from 2 neutral witnesses who had quietly stepped forward after receiving anonymous flyers accusing Michael of threatening behavior toward minors and armed surveillance. The final act didn't begin with confrontation. It began with silence. Thick, deliberate, manufactured. For 3 days, nothing happened. No trucks parked on the hill, no new complaints, no movement on the back trail. Even Karen went quiet. Michael had learned enough about her style to recognize that this wasn't retreat. It was the breath before impact. When the move came, it came not with force but with false formality. A county officer delivered a notice to his cabin stating that his parcel had been flagged for temporary injunction, pending the outcome of a community-led civil inquiry regarding abuse of shared environmental resources. The language was vague but dangerous. It implied abuse. It carried the weight of potential fines, hearings, perhaps even injunction. It wasn't a verdict. It was an accusation designed to wear the mask of law. The officer who delivered it seemed uneasy. Michael didn't argue. He took the paper, signed the receipt, and said nothing. That night, Michael reviewed his system again. All footage was intact. Trail cams had captured Karen's son and another man, a contractor from the next town over, walking the ridgeline with surveying tools 3 days earlier, prior to the injunction notice. That wasn't coincidence. That was orchestration. He marked the footage, dated it, and sent it directly to Dana. Her reply was brief. "This is the tipping point. I'll file the counter. Be ready." The next morning, a sheriff's cruiser arrived. Not Rickman this time. A different deputy, young and uncomfortable in his uniform. He walked with clipped steps, holding a folder in front of him like a shield. "We've had a formal request for voluntary interview," he said, not quite looking Michael in the eye. "They're claiming you've been interfering with the environmental sensors installed near the ridge, devices used for conservation tracking." Michael didn't answer immediately. He knew the accusation was fabricated. He'd seen no sensors, no posted notices about them, nothing indicating state installation. But he also knew that to deny outright was to engage. So he simply said, "I'd like that request in writing." The deputy nodded, perhaps relieved. "Understood. I'll leave it in your box." And then he left. By that evening, something had shifted again. A second cruiser came, this time stopping not at his gate but on the adjacent trail. Two uniformed officers stepped out and began photographing the boundary markers. Michael filmed them from a distance. He didn't interfere. Later that night, Dana called. Her tone was sharper than usual. "I spoke with a friend in the county office. Karen tried to file a motion today, unofficial but persistent. She wants emergency oversight of your property during the dispute window. That would give her access rights under the pretense of environmental inspection. If it passes, she could be up there with a clipboard and 2 fake consultants by morning." Michael listened without moving. "Can we stop it?" he asked. "We already have," Dana replied. "I filed an emergency motion of injunctive relief this afternoon." A judge reviewed the material and issued a temporary freeze on all third-party activity related to your parcel. Effective immediately. You're safe. For now. Michael exhaled. It wasn't victory, but it was containment. The next day, the story broke. Not in newspapers, not online, but locally, through whispers, fractured alliances, and the slow collapse of confidence. One of Karen's longtime supporters, a man who had signed 3 separate complaints against Michael, quietly admitted under oath that he'd never witnessed any wrongdoing. He'd been told what to write, told it was just procedural, told it was part of a community campaign to weed out the unstable element. That man's retraction collapsed the timeline of allegations like a row of dominoes. Others followed, some backing out, others going quiet. The sheriff's office stopped showing up. The environmental claim was rescinded. The civil inquiry was dropped without hearing. Karen didn't leave town, but she did vanish from the front lines. Her porch light stopped coming on at night. Her son stopped making rounds. The community patrol stickers came off the trucks. No apologies, no admissions, just silence. The kind of silence that arrives when power loses shape. The kind that settles over a place like fog after a failed storm. And Michael? He didn't celebrate. He didn't spike a football. He continued sealing the windows, marking the trees for winter cut, replacing the side gate hinge. Not out of fear, out of rhythm, out of understanding that what he'd won wasn't security. It was the right to hold ground, a right he had always possessed, but which now stood unchallenged. One night, much later, he stood on the edge of the clearing with a flashlight in hand. The woods were quiet again. No watchers, no trespassers, just wind and pine. He didn't smile, but he allowed himself one brief moment of stillness before heading back inside. The war wasn't over, but it was no longer invisible, and that made all the difference. Winter arrived in the valley without fanfare. The leaves had long since fallen, and the air took on that dry, sharp quality that made even the simplest sounds carry further through the trees. For the first time in months, Michael walked his land without watching shadows. The paths that had once felt like corridors of tension were now just trails again, blanketed in frost and silence. The signs were gone. The patrols had stopped. The messages, typed, whispered, left like breadcrumbs, had ceased. And though Karen remained somewhere in the background of it all, her presence had evaporated from the community's visible structure. No more committee votes, no more initiatives. Her name faded from the center of every conversation. Her influence now spoken of only in vague tones, like something people preferred to pretend never got out of hand. The county eventually sent a formal letter apologizing for the procedural overlap that had led to the multiple filings against his property, but Michael didn't respond. It wasn't personal, not to them. He knew that. They hadn't been complicit so much as useful, turned into tools by someone who understood how to feed systems just enough narrative to activate them. Dana's final filings had closed all pending disputes, and no further action was anticipated. Still, she advised Michael to keep everything archived for at least 2 years. People forget, but not everyone forgives exposure, she warned. Michael agreed. He wasn't counting on time to erase anything. Ron from the feed store eventually came up the ridge one afternoon under the pretense of delivering a part for a busted water pump Michael hadn't ordered. They stood by the porch without saying much at first until Ron finally muttered, "Glad you didn't leave." Michael simply nodded. Ron went on, voice low. "Lot of folks weren't sure what to believe. Karen made it sound like you were building a fortress. Turns out it was just a man trying to live in peace." Michael replied without bitterness, "Some people can't stand quiet unless they control it." Ron didn't argue. Before he left, he added, "There's talk about forming a new community board." Nothing formal, just folks who want to avoid this kind of thing again. Michael didn't commit to anything, but he knew the undertone, an invitation not to lead, but to be present. And that, in itself, was acknowledgement. In the following weeks, Michael noticed small signs that the social temperature was changing. A neighbor he'd only seen once before stopped on the trail to ask about his fencing technique. A retired couple walking their dog offered him venison stew from their freezer. He accepted it all without assumption. He didn't ask for explanations or apologies. The gestures were enough. People didn't always admit what they knew. They just behaved differently when the fear lifted. On the first morning of full snowfall, Michael stood on the porch with coffee in hand, watching the woods fill with white silence. No footprints, no signs of movement, just clarity. It occurred to him then that the land no longer felt like a test. It felt owned, not in the legal sense, though that was never in doubt, but in the deeper way people mean when they talk about belonging. He hadn't forced anyone to accept him. He had simply refused to be erased. And in the end, that was what turned the tide. Not confrontation, not vengeance, just the enduring presence of someone who couldn't be framed into silence. Later that season, he visited the sheriff's office, not with a complaint, but with a gift. A hard drive, labeled and cataloged, containing every file, image, and report from the entire ordeal. "You may never need this," he told Rickman, "but if someone else shows up in that valley and it starts again, give them a head start." Rickman didn't ask questions. He just nodded and shook his hand. Michael returned to the cabin that evening and finished installing the final section of winter insulation. Outside, the forest was still, waiting for spring. Inside, there was warmth. Not just from the wood stove, but from the knowing that the ground he stood on was his not because he had claimed it, but because he had endured it. He hadn't come here to fight, but he had stayed to finish. And now the mountain was quiet for the right reasons.